Hello everyone, my name is Matt Kelly. I'm the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer at the Texas Department of Information Resources. This video is intended to provide an overview of the Texas Risk and Authorization Management Program, also known as TexRAMP. In October of 2022, the DIR Board of Directors approved a revision to the Texas Risk and Authorization Management Program Manual, which outlines some of the functions and processes associated with the program. I will be talking a little bit about those changes today, as well as providing a recap of the existing structure of the program. So with that, what is a RAMP and what is TexRAMP? So RAMP is an acronym that stands for Risk and Authorization Management Program. It is intended to provide a standardized approach to the assessment, authorization, and monitoring of cloud systems on an ongoing basis to mitigate any potential negative outcomes. DIR was charged with standing up a statewide RAMP by December 1st of 2021 via Senate Bill 475 of the 87th legislative session. I'll note here that Texas is one of the first states to implement a centralized RAMP, and we have taken some inspiration from the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, as well as State RAMP and the Arizona Risk and Authorization Management Program, which was implemented shortly prior to this legislation. I'll have some details on the differences between FedRAMP, StateRAMP, and TexRAMP later on in this presentation, but they are all distinct programs, and there's some overlap in the overall goals, but the programs themselves and the organizations are completely distinct. So with that, who does TexRAMP apply to, and what does it apply to? So the entities are state-level entities, so state agencies, public institutions of higher education, and public community colleges. All of the entities that are subject to Chapter 2054 of Texas Government Code need to ensure compliance in their contracts with the TexRAMP program. It applies to any contracts that those entities are entering or renewing to provide or purchase cloud computing services for their organization. Here I'll also note that there is some required contract language which can be found in the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts statewide contracting and procurement manual relating to this provision. So be sure to check that out and incorporate it in your contracts accordingly, your cloud computing contracts accordingly. The program took effect January 1st, 2022, and we have set forth the minimum certification level requirements that are needed prior to entering or renewing a contract. And we have it staggered in such a way that the level 2 contracts, which we will get into, are required currently, and then the level 1 cloud computing services are required on January 1st of 2024 as of this latest revision of the program manual. So here's the overall governance structure if you're interested in learning more of the underlying mechanics and legal aspects of the program. Section 2054.0593 is the statute that enables TexRAMP and charges DIR with establishing a rule and the program. And then after the statute, we look to the rule that was established in the initial implementation of the program. That is Texas Administrative Code, or 1 TAC 202.27 for state agencies and 202.77 for institutions of higher education. And then within the rule, we also reference two external documents, the program manual and the actual control baselines. The program manual is the lower level of granularity, which we have just updated, and the control baselines are the actual security controls that are required for the corresponding certification levels, level 1 and level 2. Level 2 builds upon level 1, so if you have a level 2 certification and a customer agency requires level 1, then that is already covered because you've demonstrated that you're meeting the level 1 controls by achieving a level 2 certification. Okay, most of the resources and additional information can be found on our TexRAMP webpage, which is on the DIR website. So you can get a copy of the TexRAMP program manual there, as well as links to various resources, FAQs, the controls, and other information that's going to help you prepare for achieving certification and answer your questions going forward. We also have a dedicated email box that you can reach out to, which is tx-ramp@dir.texas.gov. And our staff is happy to meet to discuss any questions that you have throughout the process. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with some important points around the program here. So certifications are on a product by product basis or an information system by information system basis rather than on the vendor by vendor. So it's very well possible that a vendor can have multiple certifications, and one certification per product is how this is structured. So if you're acquiring a system through different contract vehicles or resellers, it's really that certification travels with that system rather than if one entity is selling it or another entity is selling it. So it's a one certification per one system basis, and it's not at the vendor level. That's a very important point to remember. The developer/manufacturer of the cloud service is the entity that's responsible for obtaining the certification. So whoever is in charge of developing the code, of maintaining the application, it's really that organization, not a reseller organization or a managed service organization that should be seeking the certification for it. It's really who is in charge of the control implementation of that cloud service. So to reiterate, the resellers of cloud services do not need a separate certification. However, if you are a reseller, you need to be aware that state agencies, institutions of higher education, and community colleges may require a TexRamp certification prior to being able to purchase that cloud service from your contract listings. Agencies are responsible for determining whether a product is in scope or a cloud service is in scope. So we have a section within the program manual that details some categories and characteristics of cloud computing services that are not subject to TexRamp. So when it comes to determining whether or not something requires a certification, that is ultimately up to the agency leadership, and their general counsel to determine whether or not that fits the criteria of the out of scope or not subject section, and then documenting a justification for that internally. Agencies are also responsible for determining the minimum certification level. Because our agency does not have full visibility into how that cloud service is intended to be used, the agency needs to determine whether or not it requires a level 1 certification or a level 2 certification, or whether it's in scope or out of scope or not subject to TexRamp. Time to obtain certification can vary and depends on the vendor capability and preparedness. So we often get questions, how long does it take to get certified? And that's going to vary pretty wildly depending on whether the documentation of the vendor is up to date, if it's structured in the same format, and how quickly the cloud service providers can respond to our inquiries and requests for clarification. Requests to initiate an assessment are best submitted by the cloud service provider directly, because they typically have the most accurate information and can provide us with the appropriate contacts to get the process started. And a word of caution for all cloud service providers or all entities seeking certification out there: you're going to need to have the right points of contact involved throughout this process to achieve that certification, including your IT departments, your information security departments. You need some management buy-in. You need to get with the folks involved in actually implementing the controls to be able to get this process done smoothly without a lot of back and forth between the assessors and your teams. Proper documentation is a vital component of this. In the new iteration of the program, we have developed a standardized, templatized security plan document that has replaced the policies and additional system security documentation artifacts that we had previously requested. This is intended to streamline the process and account for variations in the policies and procedure structures, the various frameworks out there that folks may be using. So we have developed a standardized template that we ask to complete. Again, thoroughness is a significant component in ensuring that we can do these in an expeditious manner. So don't skimp on the documentation, and make sure that you're addressing the actual controls and providing us with enough evidence and information up front so that we can process these in a timely manner. If you have a cloud computing service that has a FedRAMP or StateRAMP authorization at the equivalent level, then those are automatically certified by proxy. We reconcile and true up those lists on approximately a weekly basis. And those certifications, or those authorizations rather, are tied to our certifications at the respective level. So we've got TextRAMP level 1 certification, which corresponds to a FedRAMP or StateRAMP low authorization, and a level 2 certification, which corresponds to a FedRAMP or StateRAMP moderate authorization. Note that TextRAMP does not have a high certification or authorization. Our top or ceiling in this is the TextRAMP level 2 certification, which is the moderate. If an agency is to require a high authorization beyond that of TextRAMP, then that would be handled on an agency by agency and contract by contract basis. So there's no action required if you have the FedRAMP or StateRAMP equivalent statuses. But if our records seem to be out of date, or if there was a change recently that you want to be updated on our certified products list, then you can always reach out and let us know so that we can address it in a more timely manner than our routine sync up between those marketplaces and our certified products list. Okay, again, focusing on the scope of all of this, this is not intended for vendors' internal cloud services such as their ticketing systems or emails, really. What we're looking at is where is the agency data going and where can we draw that boundary around it in terms of the cloud services that are being provided to an agency. So if you keep drawing that line of degree down the road, you could end up in, hundreds of thousands of cloud services that are all being incorporated as part of this, but really what we're focusing on is where the customer data is going. So just because you're contracting with a vendor and they may happen to use some cloud services in the delivery of a service, if your agency data is not being processed, stored, or transmitted by those subsequent external systems or cloud services, then that's not really what the intent of the program is for. It's for the infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service that your agency data is interacting with. It's also not intended for custom development and builds. Through these custom efforts or application development efforts, the customer agency has the ability to specify what the requirements are, and it's not being sold as a software as a service as much as it is a development service. Now, if you are developing a custom application and plan to host it in an infrastructure as a service provider in the future, then that infrastructure component could very well fall under the realm of TextRAMP, but the actual application in a custom development is largely going to be out of scope. Again, the agency is the entity that's ultimately responsible for determining this. So when in doubt, I encourage you all to check with your general counsel and your leadership to make a determination on whether or not you are complying with the statutory and rule requirements of TextRAMP for these sorts of cases. Again, look at where your data are when you're scoping this out. SaaS products are not automatically covered by a certified infrastructure as a service provider. So let's say a vendor has a software application that they are selling as a service to an agency, and they're hosting it in a GovCloud certified infrastructure provider environment. The certification or authorization of the infrastructure provider does not cover the software as a service provider. There are several, if not more, controls that the software provider needs to demonstrate are in place prior to that software package actually getting a certification. So it's very important to note, just because something's hosted in a certified or authorized infrastructure environment does not mean that the application itself has a certification. Provisional certification does not necessarily imply that the product is secure. Particularly with our new structure, we are looking to leverage provisional certification by collecting an inventory of all the third-party and self-attested security assurances and artifacts that are available for agencies' review, but that does not mean that there has been a thorough review of those artifacts. So keep that in mind when you're contracting for something with provisional certification. You may want to structure the contract language in such a way that protects your organization, as well as conduct your own internal reviews for those things that necessitate a deeper dive into the security posture of a vendor. The ultimate idea of achieving provisional certification is for that product to go through the standardized approach where our assessors go through and review the documentation and make a determination that they are meeting the minimum criteria, but the provisional certification itself is something that does not imply that a third-party assessment has been done. TexRamp does not cover specific regulatory requirements, so we are leveraging NIST 853 Revision 5 controls as part of our TexRamp assessment review. So if you've got specific regulatory requirements as an agency, you still need to ensure that the appropriate language and requirements in your contracts are there to cover whatever regulations may exist. Agencies, I highly encourage you to communicate the requirements to your vendors directly. Everyone has limited resources, and it's difficult to communicate everything to every vendor out there. So highly encourage you to communicate what your requirements are specifically, since the agencies are the ones that determine whether or not the product is subject to TexRamp, as well as what the minimum levels are. So giving those vendors enough information and enough lead time for them to make an informed decision about the route they want to take is very important to ensuring that things can run smoothly. Again, reiterating, vendors should be the ones that request the assessment. With some of the changes, this has changed recently, so we're trying to funnel all of the requests for certification through the vendors to DIR rather than agency initiated requests for assessments. And then in the new program as well, we have a agency-sponsored certification that has a shorter time frame. This is intended to bridge the gap between when a vendor can go through the formal intake process and complete the inventory and acknowledgement questionnaire, and thus achieving provisional certification, and when an agency may have some immediate pressing contract deadlines, procurement deadlines that need to be achieved. Okay. So those are just some important points. I know it's kind of out of order there, but I'm going to dive into the TexRamp scoping next.
Hello, my name is Sophia Shelton, and I'll be going over the scoping section in this TexRamp overview video. So we already discussed who does this apply to, what does this apply to, and what does this take effect, including the new 2.0 changes made to TexRamp. So now let's jump more into the scope itself. Let's determine the scope and also determine the TexRamp level certification that'd be required. First, you'll need to determine the scope just to see if TexRamp certification is required for yourself. And if that's the case, these are the questions you can ask to see if your purchase is in scope for TexRamp. First is this for a contract to purchase cloud computing services? Does it meet the definition of a cloud computing service? Does it fall into the out of scope category or characteristics? What is the impact level of the information resource? And does or will the cloud computing service process, store, or transmit confidential information? So that first question, TexRamp certification is required for new contracts or the renewal of a contract. So the cloud service provider must be TexRamp certified or have an active provisional certification. The next question, does it meet the definition of cloud computing service? So the definition of a cloud computing service is a cloud computing is a model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources that can be rapidly provisioned and released with minimal management effort or service provider interaction. You have the definition, but does that necessarily mean that your staff will be able to easily identify what a cloud computing service is? If you need to help them actually identify that as a part of your process, give staff the ability to do so, you might want to consider developing a cloud service identification worksheet. So these are some examples, but I recommend you work with your stakeholders within your IT office, your cybersecurity office, with critical stakeholders to help identify what questions make sense for an individual in your team, your staff in general, be able to answer questions and help them at least think maybe this product that I'm about to procure is in scope of TextRamp. So an example are the questions that I have listed here, and I'll read them off. So first is a contract for an IT service to build a solution? If the answer is yes to this, that might possibly mean that the service is a development service and not necessarily a software as a service. So with a development service, this could mean that this is a custom developed solution that's being specifically built for a customer. So that's something to consider. Then the question, does the system use virtual machines? If their response is a no, this might mean that they're not a cloud. You see oftentimes virtual machines are common within hosted cloud environments. Does the system have the ability to expand its capacity to meet customer demand? So if this response is a no, that might mean that it's not a cloud service. Often you'll see cloud services have the potential to expand its service just to provide that scalability for a customer. Does the system allow the consumer to build anything other than servers? A no response to this might mean that it's an infrastructure as a service. But on the other side, if they say yes, this might mean that it's a platform as a service, or maybe even a software as a service. Does the system offer the ability to create databases? Again, just another example that if they say yes to this, maybe this means that it's a platform as a service. Same thing with the question, does the system offer various developer toolkits and APIs? Does the system offer only applications that are available by obtaining a login? Another example where, depending on your response, it may mean that it's a cloud computing service, where yes, could be that this is just a software as a service, but depending on what they're logging into, that system may potentially be either a platform as a service or infrastructure as a service. So it's good to get some input from critical stakeholders, such as your IT team, to really drill down those questions that meet your needs. After checking the contract start date, seeing if the item actually is a cloud service, let's see if the cloud service is actually in the out of scope category. So the next question we ask is, does it fall into the out of scope categories or characteristics? So there are some cloud services that are out of scope, but specifically you want to ensure that the cloud computing service does not create, process, or store confidential state-controlled data. Besides the data used to provide a login capability, such as a username or password or email, or even data like just payment information for booking or reservations. Those are sort of examples of out of scope, as long as it does not create, process, or store confidential information. On here is a list of some of those cloud services that would meet that criteria. In our TextRamp manual, there is a larger list. Just to give you examples, what I have displayed on the screen is things like a design or illustration tool, email notification or distribution tool, survey tool, web apps for purchasing supplies, reservations, or travel. So these are all examples in which that the cloud service, if you're procuring it, does not create, process, or store confidential data, but has these functions. One thing to note, though, is if you do decide when you're procuring a product that it does actually fit into one of these out-of-scope categories, recommend that agencies should document those cloud services designated as out-of-scope in accordance with agency policy. Not only are you just documenting it for your historical reference, but you're aligning up to what you have established in policy as well. So the next two questions are actually to help you determine what TextRamp certification level is needed. So now that we've identified that if a service is cloud, it's in scope, how do you determine the TextRamp level certification required? Well, the first part is impact. And with impact, Information resources whose loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability could be expected to have the following identified. For low impact, a limited adverse effect on operations, assets, or individuals. For moderate impact, a serious adverse effect on operations, assets, or individuals, versus high impact, where you notice a severe or catastrophic adverse effect on operations, assets, or individuals. So we have examples in which such an event could include, and I'm just going to read a few of them. For low impact, you'll notice a cause of degradation in mission capability to an extent and duration that the organization can perform its primary function, but the effectiveness of the function is noticeably reduced. With moderate impact, you'll see that a cause of significant degradation in mission capability to an extent and duration that the organization can perform its primary function, but the effectiveness of the function is significantly reduced. And what you'll notice with the high impact is such an event could be a cause of severe degradation in or loss of mission capability to an extent and duration the organization is not able to perform one or more of its primary functions. So these are examples that can help you identify what is a low, moderate, or high impact to your organization and how that service is reflected in that. Sometimes it helps, though, to have quantifiable numbers. So these are strictly examples for illustrative purposes. You, as an organization within your agency, need to really define what is a low, moderate, or high impact based off of your needs. So these are good conversations to have with your critical stakeholders, trying to identify, are there specific metrics that we can use to help staff identify what's the impact of this service if it's not available? So as an example of some of these impact items, to look at low impact, you may want to use the number of confidential records that are affected. So for low impact, as an example, we're saying that potentially with fewer than 1,000 confidential records affected, that might be considered a low impact system. For moderate impact, if you wanted to use a different type of number, such as monetary, what about $10,000 to $99,999 in potential damages? That might be a measure you use to identify moderate impact. Now, high impact, such an event for a high impact could be something like fines or some type of judgment. And that might be a percentage where you have over 25% chance of getting a fine or a judgment happen. So different types of measures to help you identify what can I quantify as a low, moderate, or high impact. Okay, last question when determining the scope. Does or will the cloud computing service process, store, or transmit confidential information? So with confidential information, ultimately, a state agency is responsible for determining the level of TexRAMP certification level for the cloud computing service that they're procuring. Now, with these broad categories of non-confidential and confidential information, this can include regulated, confidential, sensitive, and public data. So it's important to determine which baseline is most appropriate for a cloud computing service that processes information classified specifically by the state agency subject to the data classification policy and implemented by that agency. And really what this is saying is you have your own data classification policies, and that's going to help you actually determine if this is confidential information involved or not. So there's this larger definition of what confidential information has, according to the Texas Administrative Code, including these items here that are considered confidential information, but it's not limited to only this. So a few of the examples that are on here can include things like date of birth of a living person, credit card numbers, sensitive personal information, regulated data, those items that can be defined as confidential information. In our text ramp manual, we have more of these examples in there, but just for your reference, I have them here displayed on the screen. So when we ask that question, does or will the cloud computing service process, store, or transmit confidential information? If your answer is no, then that will help you determine that this is a text ramp level 1 certification that's required, versus yes, that confidential information is involved. That can help you determine that maybe this is now a level 2 certification that is required. So now that we've answered all these questions to determine the scope and see that an item is in scope, really, do we know what level that we need? So to determine the text ramp level, we talked about it a little bit, but the items that you need to know for which level certification is required is the confidential information or not being confidential information. If it's not confidential, that's a level 1. And with a level 2, that's confidential information. And then there's the impact level itself. So for level 1, that's a low impact, and level 2, that's a moderate or high impact. Both of these certifications are valid for 3 years. The difference between the level 1 and level 2 when we're talking about dates is level 2 text ramp certification is required for cloud services as of January 1st of 2022. And the level 1 cloud certification required for cloud services that fit that level 1 criteria with the updates made to text ramp manual 2.0 version, that it has now changed to January 1st of 2024, in which a level 1 certification is required. Additionally, besides just having this level 1 or level 2 certification, there is the route of the provisional certification. So provisional certification is given to a cloud service provider, and that's given without the determination of this needs to be a level 1 or level 2. It doesn't, having that provisional certification doesn't say that this is now going to be a level 1 or level 2. It's that interim period in which the vendor is seeking a full level 1 or level 2 certification, but at least with the provisional certification, they can continue with contracting. So we talked about determining the text ramp levels, how non-confidential or public information is involved, or the impact of the system, whether it's high, moderate, low. Taking these two pieces of information, that will help you determine your text ramp level. So we have this chart here that's helpful because I talked earlier about what are out of scope items. There's a reference to an example of a non-confidential low impact, which is out of scope if it's a software as a service. And if you go into the text ramp manual, you'll see more examples or more items that are in that out of scope category. So besides the data involved in the impact level, another way to determine text ramp certification is if your cloud service already has an authorization through another ramp authorized mechanism. Specifically, that's the state ramp or FedRAMP authorization. So for level 1 text ramp certification, if an item has a low authorization from FedRAMP or state ramp, then that's equivalent to a text ramp level 1 certification, which we process on our end. And then if the item is a moderate authorization, that would be at level 2. Then also there are those cloud services that are in the process of getting their FedRAMP authorization or state ramp authorization. And those items that have that status where they are not authorized, but they are working on it and they're in the system and we can see it, those can indicate that this has a text ramp provisional status assigned to it, as long as it indicates that progress is being made towards achieving that authorization. So to recap, we talked about the question to determine if you're in scope and also how to identify what text ramp level certification. The questions that you want to consider is it a contract to purchase cloud computing services for the agency? That can help dictate then if it actually meets the criteria for out of scope. And if it doesn't meet their criteria for out of scope, you want to consider the impact, right? So is it a low impact information resource? If yes, that might determine your text ramp certification level. But if no, then also consider your confidential information. If that's involved, that also can determine your text ramp certification level. Thank you.